Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues and guests, it is my distinct honor to introduce Deјвид Moriss, a distinguished expert on risks and opportunities in the international business environment, cultural exchange, and global partnerships. With an impressive global career, Mr. Moriss has served as an Australian and multilateral diplomat and senior advisor to governments, business, universities, and the United Nations. Mr. Moriss is the Vice Chair of the United Nations Sustainable Business Network for Asia Pacific, where he provides critical advice to the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific. Additionally, he is a non-resident senior fellow at the Center for China and Globalization, recognized as China's leading non-government think tank. He also holds the position of Senior Research Fellow at the Beijing Foreign Studies University and serves as Vice President of the Eurasian Cultural Exchange Association. Throughout his career, Mr. Moriss has tackled security challenges across regions from Southeast Asia to the Balkans. He has been a major contributor to the well-regarded reforms proposals for the United Nations and its peacekeeping operations. His innovative soft power strategies have significantly supported Australian businesses and cultural promotion worldwide. For nearly a decade, Mr. Moriss served as a senior political advisor, leading major policy reforms in governance, international trade promotion, environmental protection, healthcare, industry, and regional development. His efforts in coordinating trade and investment missions have strengthened ties between Australia and countries such as China, Japan, India, Malaysia, and the United States. He has effectively managed campaigns, built strong media relations, and pioneered advancements in social media and targeted promotions. So, dear friends, please join me in welcoming Mr. Deјvid Moriss, whose profound expertise and contributions continue to shape the global landscape. And Deјvid, please, you have the floor.
Well, thank you very much, Alex, and thanks everyone for coming, and anyone online who's joined as well. That was a very long introduction, and I thank you for that. I have had a very eclectic career. I've done many different things. I've jumped around from position to position and from role to role. That's just my attitude to life. I like to jump around and do different things. But there has been a thread of continuity through all of that, and I suppose it has been that my particular interest has been, as an Australian, how can a medium-sized country in a part of the world that is undergoing a seismic, an earth-shattering change, how can a medium-sized or a small-sized country continue to exist and protect its interests? And so perhaps that's of interest to small and medium-sized countries all around the world, because we all have some things in common when we're not major powers. And I'm very conscious that being here in this wonderful, cool city of Belgrade that I love, I'm very conscious of your history, and I think you have an understanding of the brutal and hard realities sometimes of geopolitics. I'm going to suggest, as a cheery, optimistic Aussie, that while there is the hard, brutal reality of geopolitics, there is also an alternative, which is the potential to have productive and mutually beneficial relationships between countries. Now, you can't always achieve one while you're pursuing the other, but what I want to suggest is that there is a spectrum of options available to leaders at all times. And so where you choose to position your strategies on that spectrum, I think, is the critical question. And I think every country pursues hard, realist geopolitical realities at the same time as needing to pursue cooperative strategies with, particularly if you're in business, or if you're in a community organisation, or if you're just in society generally, you need to be able to live at peace and with prosperity as your day-to-day aims, while your governments seek to be secure. So that's just an introduction to the bias I'm going to bring to this, and it may be a particular English language bias as well, because I'm conscious that in the international relations discourse of the last 70 or 80 years, the English language has been particularly the English language discourse has been particularly dominant because of the dominance of the United States. And so there's no doubt that as I'm operating in the English language, that I'm very influenced by that English language discourse. And I really invite anyone to challenge any comment I make and to in your questions, to question whether in fact we are all operating in the same reality, because I think this is a critical question. I'm just making some introductory comments here before I talk about China and the West, but I think a critical question for us to think about at all times. And for when you're listening to me, when I'm listening to you, we need to think about, are we actually culturally understanding each other? We might be speaking a common language, but are we actually, do we have the same assumptions? Do we actually understand the assumptions of the other side? These are questions we have all of us in every society we've grappled with cultures that are different, with mindsets that are different. Sometimes that's very close next door to us. Quite often here in Europe, there are very different clashing mindsets very close to each other. But equally, at a global level, we've had clashing mindsets as well. And maybe we're in a period of another clash to come. And I think these are my introductory comments I want to make before I start to talk about China and the West. Now, before I do, I want to go back, before I talk about the now and the future, I want to reflect a little bit on how we got to where we are in the English language international relations discourse. How did we get to where we are now with China and the West? And I think here my comment about geopolitics being the hard, brutal reality is very important for us to remember that the beginning of the modern era in relationship to China and the West really is probably Kissinger going to China. So 1972, 1973, the early 1970s marked a huge shift in China's relationship with the United States, and therefore China's relationship with the West. It allowed China, which in the early 1970s was, as arguably still today, the largest country by population on Earth, although India might have just passed China. If it hasn't in the last year, it's about to. But certainly in the 1970s, there was China, the largest country on Earth in population, but it was not participating in the international system. It was not a member of the United Nations. It was blocked by the US from being a member of the United Nations. It had had no role in forming the international system in 1919, in 1945, and arguably even later in 1989. Each big shift in the international system really didn't have China as a player. So China being able to establish a working relationship with the United States in the early 70s, I think is where I want to begin my comments. And I think while later, in a few minutes, I'm going to talk about economic interdependence and more optimistic, liberal ideas about an international system, the reality of what Kissinger did in going to Beijing was a hard, brutal reality that the US was prizing China away from the Soviet Union. And it was a brilliant move for the United States to do so. It was a brilliant move for China to build a more productive relationship with what was clearly by the early 70s the most powerful nation on Earth and the most powerful economy in the international system as well. And so it was about a geopolitical reality. And we could jump forward to today, which I'll get to in a few minutes, but we could jump forward to today and perhaps assess, as many geopolitical realists around the world are now jumping to the conclusion that we are now again at a point of a hard, brutal geopolitical reality that actually the United States is now separating from China. And this is a new era that we're entering. And so we'll get to that. But first I want to reflect on the period after Kissinger. So after this brilliant geopolitical move, not long after that at all, in fact, by the late 70s, China, under the very wise leadership of Deng Xiaoping and the people around him, had been looking at the world, and they'd been observing the world very closely, and they'd been observing what works and what doesn't work. And Deng Xiaoping had lots of sayings about this. You know, it doesn't matter whether the cat is black or white, and many sayings that he made about just pragmatic, practical realities. And when China looked at the world in the 1970s, what they saw was the economic success of Western economies that had adopted the market as the primary driver, and they saw the increasing failure of the Soviet Union and other countries that had adopted a centrally planned system. And so China very pragmatically made the decision ahead of the Soviet Union and ahead of other places that it would adopt the market as a player, as not a fully free market, not a United States-style free market, but the Chinese Communist Party made the decision that there needed to be a process of marketisation. There needed to be a process that allowed people to utilise their competitive urges, to the competitive strength that a market system brings to build businesses and to build prosperity. And my God, what a success that was for China. China, in liberating market forces and allowing farmers to form companies in the countryside, allowing townships to form township enterprises that could compete in a national and then an international market, ultimately building special economic zones in the cities that allowed manufacturing industry to develop and to integrate into global value chains. China didn't just think about this from theory. It was very much pragmatic. It was very much looking at what had worked in other places. And I talked about the success of the West, but actually primarily what really drove the decision more than the economic success of the advanced economies was what was happening in Asia itself, in East Asia itself. China had been watching Japan. Very important for China to watch Japan, because Japan has, of course, been in the past the mortal threat to China, and we should never forget that just as I'm conscious here of your memory of world wars, we should be conscious in China as well of their living memory of having lost about 14 million people to the Japanese Empire in the Second World War. So China was watching Japan, and what China saw in Japan was a phenomenal economic recovery in the post-war era. China was also watching Taiwan, and I'd like to admit that so much, but Taiwan too pursued a phenomenally successful economic development in the post-war era. China was also watching Singapore and Hong Kong, of course. And in each of those places, these were countries that were not unlike China in a cultural sense, in that they were culturally quite similar. They had a Confucian approach to governance, an approach that was meritocratic, an approach that was about a hierarchy of power. The state played a central role in all of those countries. Often Americans misunderstand this and think that these countries pursuing the market meant that they became like the United States. They're nothing like the United States. Japan, Taiwan, Hong Kong are Confucian societies, hierarchical, state-centred, and they pursued economic development within that cultural context by harnessing the productive power of the market and attaching it to their cultural realities. And that was very attractive to China, because China wanted also to maintain, and has always wanted to maintain, its stability and its central role for the state. And this is actually nothing new for China. This is nothing to do necessarily with communism alone in China. This is more to do with several thousand years of history in China, where China was the first state, really, in the international system. It was the first place on earth where we really identified a state mechanism that had a very, very complex system of public servants, of institutions of governance that applied rules and laws across a vast population and a vast territory. And that while there have been discontinuities and there have been periods of chaos and disruption in China, not least the so-called century of humiliation, when the European imperialist powers divided up the ports of China and weakened China enormously. But despite the periods of instability between empires, and despite the century of humiliation, despite World War II, China still sees itself the way it has seen itself for thousands of years, and that is, it is a state, it is a civilization, it is therefore, in a sense, a civilization state, as many foreign observers say about China. It's a controversial thing to say, but I think from my experience, it's quite a useful way for us as outsiders to look in to China, to understand that it is a civilization to itself. And so when it looked for models, China really did look to East Asian models, and those East Asian models were very powerful ones indeed. The way that Japan, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and later, of course, Malaysia, Singapore, many others, the way that they integrated themselves into global supply chains, the way they had access, they took advantage of the access to the US market, the fact that the United States was relatively open to Asian exports made a huge difference. They took advantage of some of the disruptions of the Cold War era, what was called the Cold War here in Europe, because there wasn't conflict, was of course a hot war in Asia, in East Asia. We had the Korean War, we had the Vietnam War, and actually those conflicts, as awful as they were, brought a whole lot of economic activity, a whole lot of American investment, and American expenditure was brought to East Asia as a result of those wars. And so these East Asian economies took advantage of that. They drew American investment, they drew American expenditure, and they accessed the American market. And therefore, they took advantage, in particular later when we saw, after the Vietnam War, the beginning of a long peace in East Asia. Each of those countries took advantage of that long peace. And so China comes in as an economic player after being such a poor country and so disconnected from the world. It enters the fray, it joins the race for economic development in the 1970s, at a time that those other East Asian economies are already developing very successfully. They've all been growing at growth rates of between 6 to 10% annually. They've been leaping up the charts. Japan becomes a highly developed economy again, as it had been. But these new starts, the new tigers, the tiger economies of East Asia, grow so successfully through that combination of a strong state, a state strategy that brings in business partners to work with the state, that there are industry strategies. This is again very misunderstood in the United States, but the East Asian economies had industry strategies that they favoured particular industries, they subsidised, but overwhelmingly they embraced the access to free markets and the ability to place themselves as critical players in international value chains. And so the 1980s becomes this period of 1980s and 1990s becomes this period of enormous economic success in East Asia. The period of conflict is behind us. Of course, by 1989, the global situation has shifted as well, and China begins its steady growth, which I would argue is rather similar to the models that it had followed. The difference is that it's on such a grand scale. So the difference is that while Hong Kong became a very rich and developed economy in a couple of decades, mainland China goes through the same process, but it's on such a scale that it's thousands of Hong Kongs. And of course, there are some differences as well in that the nature of the party state in China means that the state-centric approach is even stronger than in these other Confucian societies. It ripples through every dimension of the society and every dimension of the economy. So it's not like where in South Korea or Japan the government has industry roundtables with the big industry players and they develop a strategy and they cooperate. In China, they have the round table with the big industry players, but they're told what to do. So it's a qualitative difference from the countries around it. But while it's a qualitative difference, it's only a difference of degree, because culturally it actually comes from the same place. It comes from the place of a state actually having a coherent development strategy. And so given the success of this process in East Asia, China becomes, by the 90s and by the turn of this century, becomes very confident that it has found the solution to the dilemma that it's been facing ever since the rise of the West. It's found the solution to develop again, to again become the successful state, the prosperous state that for most of human history it was. I mean, as we know, for most of human history, China was the most advanced civilization and most advanced economy in the world. But of course, that was not the reality of the last couple of hundred years and the period of the dominance of the West. So by the end of the 20th century, which no doubt had been the American century, China increasingly starts to believe that the future belongs to China, that China can again come back and can play the role for its citizens and the role in the world that Chinese people, particularly Chinese government and leadership, believe is their rightful role. Now, how did the rest of the region approach this? I can tell you as an Australian diplomat that Australia and Japan and Singapore and all of the other key, and Korea, all of the other key economies of the region were cautiously optimistic about that period of the 80s, 90s and into the early 21st century. I say cautious because we're all aware of the hard, brutal geopolitical realities of the world, that states have interests and big states. The more powerful they become, the more difficult sometimes they can become, because they will want to impose their interests on others. So there was a caution always about a rising China, but overwhelmingly the view in East Asia, the view of Australia and Japan and Korea and others, was that the rise of China was a good thing. It's a very good thing for China to be stable, for China's population to benefit from development as it had not benefited for the last 200 years, and for China as a rising power to be integrated into the international system from which it had been excluded for decades. And so from the China's entry into the United Nations in 1977, I think it was, replacing Taiwan in the Security Council, and China's entry later into the economic architecture of the region, so APEC, which was a creation of Australia and Indonesia and Japan and the US, but was designed to integrate China. APEC was designed for China. This is often misunderstood, but I was there working in the Australian Foreign Ministry at the time when we hosted the first APEC meeting in Canberra, and I can tell you that APEC was designed to bring China into the international trading system. It was designed to embed China in that open trading, free trade environment that the countries of East Asia were benefiting from. And it was also designed to lock America into that as well, because the United States has a tendency to support free trade most of the time, but it also has a tendency, when it feels threatened, to impose tariffs and use economic coercion as US trade partners know only too well. And so APEC was designed, the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation, was designed very cleverly to be a collection of economies, not states. So it incorporates Taiwan and Hong Kong as well. It was designed to bring all of the economies of the Asia-Pacific region and lock them into a process of trade liberalisation, of openness to free trade, because it was overwhelmingly in the interests of all of those economies to do so. And the evidence of the last 50 years is that, of course, the shift of the world economy to East Asia and the success of those economies, I think, demonstrates the value for those countries. Now, we in East Asia sometimes assume that that means the rest of the world understands the value of free trade, but I don't think that's the case. I'd be interested to ask everyone in this room later what your views are, but I was giving a lecture once in Vienna, at the University of Vienna, and I spoke about the values of free trade and how East Asia had benefited from free trade. And then I did a poll in the room, and there were about 45, perhaps 50 students in the lecture theatre, and not one of them supported free trade. So that was a wake-up call to me that actually in Europe, the concept of trade is very different from the concept we have in East Asia. In East Asia, we deeply believe in the freedom for business to be able to move across borders and to have most favoured nation status. And so for an Aussie, for example, it's a no-brainer. It doesn't require any thought, because for us, we're an exporter of things that we know Asia needs. We export to Asia liquid natural gas and iron ore and lithium and all of these things that the countries of East Asia need, and we import from the countries of East Asia things that we need and that we can't make as effectively and as efficiently. So for us, the theory of free trade, the theory of openness, actually makes sense. And this has been the very interesting miracle, I think, of East Asia in the last half century, that it really represented that period of economic interdependence. Now, where this becomes interesting from an international relations perspective is that the optimism about free trade and interdependence in East Asia gets conflated, it gets mixed up in the English language discourse with liberalism. So in the United States and in Europe, where there are very vigorous and important discussions going on about regionalism, about international trade, about international order, the success of free trade in East Asia gets conflated with liberalism. So in Washington, you have think tanks, saying, well, the success of East Asia is all about the conversion to democracy. It's because Taiwan and Hong Kong and Singapore all became democracies. And then you get others scratching their heads and saying, but are those places really democracies? Because really they're more like one-party states. And then you had the US, especially in the early 21st century, starting to say, oh yes, and this, not just those countries, but the mainland China, the People's Republic of China itself, is inevitably going to become a liberal democracy as well, which to my mind as an Australian, and I think I hear a few people smiling in the audience too, I mean, it just seems so absurd, the thought that this economic change in East Asia was somehow linked to Western political theory. It actually had nothing to do with it. The shift in the systems of governance of places like Japan and Taiwan was much more to do with US influence, especially Japan after the Second World War. I mean, Japan had a constitution imposed upon it by the United States. We're all happy that happened, by the way. Those of us who live in the Asia-Pacific region were very happy to have the United States to impose a system onto Japan, and in particular a system without a strong lethal military force. But that wasn't Japan's choice. And it didn't come naturally from Japan any more than we could ever expect some import of Western liberal thought into the People's Republic of China. It was a bizarre idea, but it took hold. It took hold because by 1989 and the collapse of the Soviet Union and the rush to membership of Europe by countries like Hungary and Poland and others, this optimism took hold, this liberal optimism took hold, that we were heading towards one system in the world, and this end of history idea of Fukuyama, but not just Fukuyama, but many many thinkers, I think in Europe, there was this construction of a liberal concept of what the European Union needed to look like as Europe grew and as Europe became more of a political and not just economic entity, but as it became a larger and larger, ever expanding entity, that it would need to represent some coherent philosophical approach. And that I think there's a very vibrant and active liberal debate about that, but sometimes it is expressed as if it is the only reality, when it may well be strongly held by people in many parts of Europe. But from my experience of living in Budapest, it's not shared by everyone, and in fact, it's my view in any country, in fact, that there is always a diversity of views. There are always contested views. Even in the People's Republic of China, there are contested views. So this assumption post 1989 in the English language international relations discussion that the world was all going to become like one, I think was far too simplistic. And so looking back now, we can perhaps recognise that perhaps at the time it wasn't fully recognised, because I think again I say this as an Aussie, I think the English language discourse is very, very powerful in the United States and in Europe, because of the role of the English language in Europe as well, and the scale of the UK, although it's not what it used to be, of course. But the focus of the US is on the US in the international system. And so the US has interests in the Middle East, as we know. It has interests in Europe, as we know. So it's not just looking at East Asia. Despite pivots to Asia and all sorts of announcements by Obama and others that East Asia is the focus, it's just not. The United States is not looking at the world at all with East Asia as its prism. It's not even trying to understand the perspectives of East Asia. The US is looking at the world through US eyes, which is entirely understandable. It's not a criticism. It's just an observation. So therefore, the discussion about China and other places in Asia becoming liberal democracies, it's perhaps not surprising that America has that discourse in its own country, that liberal democracy is the system the whole world admires and wants to become like America. This is part of the American national identity, that America is the city on the hill, the citadel on the hill, and that everyone wants to be like America. So for Americans to believe that is very important to their self-identity. Unfortunately, it doesn't do them much good in their international relations, in my view. And I could say the same thing later, by the way. If I forget, you can remind me. I'll make the same comments about China, because this is about any big power that looks at the world only through its own eyes. It is inevitably going to misunderstand every other country. And equally, my comment again as an Aussie here in Europe would be that Europe also has been very focused on itself for the last few decades for absolutely understandable reasons. Your crisis here that you had here in this part of the world, which was, an appalling crisis, and absolutely I would understand why that would take 99% of your attention and energy to be focused on that, and now to be focused on finding a way forward and not to slip back into conflict. And equally for Europe as a whole, the post-Cold War period has been a period of, I think, construction, trying to construct something new and something that will prevent conflict again in the future. We're back in another conflict in Europe, in Ukraine. And so European minds and eyes are absolutely understandably focused on Europe. So again, that liberal discourse around it's inevitable that every country will want to be a liberal democracy, and we hear it now in relation to Ukraine, for example. This again is an understandable, I think, bias. But I think when it comes to China, when it comes to the rise of China as a new or returning great power in the world, we ought to be very careful about this understandable but mistaken belief in the West that China will be like us or wants to be like us. From my experience of 25 years of visiting China, of living there for a few years, of constantly reading about it and talking to people about it, I'm simply an outsider, but my view is that China does not want to be like the West. My view is that it would be unthinkable. It would just not make any sense in the Chinese way of thinking for it to be like the West. However, I think the period of the 1980s and 90s and into the 21st century is a period that it's worth us studying, because it was a period in which China did successfully develop, and it did successfully develop by integrating itself into the region and then into the global system, and it's been a rather spectacular success. So while there is a lot of doom and gloom in recent years, since Donald Trump announced that China was a strategic competitor, but let's leave aside Trump and 2016, 2017 for the moment. From 1979, from the Deng Xiaoping reforms up until 2015, the period of China's integration into the regional and global economy and into the regional and global system has been a spectacular success, I argue. I think, of course, there are exceptions. There always are exceptions. No country is perfect, and no great power is perfect at all. There are definitely areas around the fringes, around the borders of China, and there are around misunderstandings between China and other countries. There are things we could focus on, and we could talk about problems. There are problems. But overarchingly, as a comment about the shift in the international system to absorb a country the size of China, growing at the pace of China, that's bringing it to the point by 2007 to become the second biggest economy in the world, it's been a stunning success. I mean, when this sort of transition has occurred before in global history, it's led to all kinds of conflicts, all kinds of cataclysmic conflicts. And while in recent years people have become more and more convinced that's going to happen, I think it's worth us studying the period of China's rise to understand why it actually did successfully integrate itself. So China benefited enormously from integration into the global economy. And so unlike the Soviet Union, so when Americans talk about a new Cold War, what they're missing is that the Soviet Union was not part of the international economic system that the United States dominated. The Soviet Union had its own bloc that it dominated, but it was, compared with the advanced economies, was a relatively, especially by the 1980s, was a relatively dysfunctional economic bloc. And China has learnt that lesson. China has integrated itself into deep structural interdependencies with all of the major economies of the world. So while it is diversifying, very cleverly diversifying its interests globally, it retains deep interdependence with the major economies. And again, as an Aussie, I would observe that for Australia, which perhaps is not top of mind here in Europe as an economy, but in the Asia-Pacific region, the Australian economy is a rather important one. It's the 12th largest in the world, but in the Asia-Pacific region, Australia is the major supplier of resources and energy, and it's a major supplier of education and a whole range of other services as well to East Asia. And so China's interdependence with Australia has been a particular success. It's been a phenomenal success story. Again, in recent years, there have been some problems, and we can talk about those. But if you look at the expanse of history and you look at the depth of the economic relationship, that deep interdependence between China and Australia is a very interesting thing to observe. I mean, the Chinese economic miracle could not have occurred without it, in a sense, because of the supply of all of the resources, the iron ore, the gas, the coal, which is not so fashionable these days, but the supply of all of those core resources for China at very economic rates, much cheaper than it would have been for China to try and develop mines and develop trade routes to Africa or to Latin America. We could much more efficiently buy those resources from Australia. So it's deep integration with an economy like Australia. It's deep integration with Japan and with Korea as well. China is deeply economically integrated with those countries. So when we hear talk about a Cold War, it's a totally different ballgame from the US-Soviet standoff, in which the two sides had very little trade and certainly very little, if any, investment of financial interaction. China and the US and China and Japan and Korea and Australia, and of course increasingly these days as well, China with Europe, has deep interdependencies. So it's not a Cold War scenario from an economic perspective at all. And those economic interdependencies are vitally important if your country is focused on economic prosperity. And I would argue China is. I would argue that the overarching objective of Chinese strategy for the last 40 years has been economic development. And I think to the period to 2049, which will be the centenary of the People's Republic of China, I would argue that China's economic development and success will continue to be front of mind. It's becoming more complicated because China's rise is bringing with it a great power status that gives China the ability to have a whole range of other policy options that it didn't have 40 years ago. It can play a bigger role in other areas than just the economy. But while I'm talking about the economy, I do believe that it is still front and centre. And one of the reasons for that is that the economic success of China's experiment is fundamental to the continued stability of China. And you could say this about any country. I mean, you could say this about the United States, that the United States' dysfunction today is that its economic success is not widely shared, that the United States has become a very unequal society. It's hollowed out its middle class, it's hollowed out its industrial capabilities, and so it's become quite a dysfunctional political state in recent times, which is quite dangerous. It's quite dangerous. The United States appeared a few years ago to be verging on the point of some sort of major political crisis when an unsuccessful presidential candidate was talking about potentially seizing power without a democratic vote. That in the United States is an existential threat to the stability of their system and could yet be again. So any country needs to focus on its economic success and ensuring that the benefits of its economic success are broadly spread through the community in order to retain stability. We've learnt this lesson throughout history, and China has certainly learnt this lesson because it has been the economic success. It's been the construction of a middle class in China of somewhere, depending on what you call middle class, but somewhere between 400 to 800 million people in China who I would call middle class. And when I say that, what I would describe as middle class, just as let's use some non-economist jargon. I mean, economists would say you get to a certain point of development of GDP per capita, and China's got to about $12,000 GDP per capita, so that makes it's emerging as a middle income country. But actually that's an average, and an average doesn't mean very much in a country like China where you have vast differences. You have, of course, vast numbers of poor people, you also have vast numbers of rich people, but you have this middle class, and I would describe them in non-economist terms as people who can afford to buy a house, who might be able to afford to buy a house for their son, who, if their son wants a wife, then they need to own their own apartment. They might be able to afford to send their son or daughter overseas to have a university education in Australia or Canada or the US. They might be able to afford to buy the latest model Tesla or BYD electric vehicle. Just been in China, and about 50% of the new cars coming onto the roads are these beautiful new electric vehicles, and people are buying them. I mean, people have the money. Hundreds of millions of people in China have the money to have the disposable income to have this sort of lifestyle. They can have holidays, they can save money, and in fact they are saving. They're probably saving too much money in China these days. There's not enough spending going on, and there's too much saving in the Chinese economy, which is a big problem, but that'll be solved in time. But it is a function of a growing middle class, and that is providing this enormous stability. And while there are some real deep economic challenges now that China's facing, and they're very serious, I would argue the focus of the leadership in China remains economic. It still remains it still is the number one priority for China to maintain its growth curve. It's not going to be growing at the rates that it was growing in recent decades, and that was always inevitable, that there would be a slowdown. The slowdowns come a bit faster and harder than anyone would have hoped in China for a whole lot of reasons, and we can come to those. But I think the focus on economic development does come first. So that was the period of the golden age, if you like, this age of peace in East Asia, this age of economic development, and so this very successful rise of China. And China joins the regional economic infrastructure like APEC. As we know, it then joins the World Trade Organization and embeds itself in the international economy. At the same time, not just in economic terms, but in terms of playing a bigger role as a global power, China also begins in the late 20th century and in more of the last couple of decades, it also starts to play a much bigger role in international institutions. And so not just the WTO, but China becomes very active in the United Nations. The United Nations that used to exclude China now has China fielding candidates for the heads of agencies, and China's had several now heads of different UN bodies. I think it has one at the moment, but it's had several over recent decades. China is now the biggest contributor to UN peacekeeping of all the Security Council Permanent Five, and one of the biggest in the world, regardless of its P5 membership. China's become very active in the international financial system as well, because again, it's the second biggest economy in the world. It was running this huge imbalanced trade relationship with the US for a long time. So the US, just as it was not attending to its middle class in the US, and just as it was deindustrializing, the US also got itself, I would argue, into an imbalanced relationship with China, where it was importing a whole lot more than it was exporting. This was a huge policy failure of successive US administrations, I would argue, but obviously Trump and others would blame China for this. But I would argue the US made these policy decisions and structurally failed to adapt to the rise of China and allowed China to benefit more than the US benefited from the bilateral trade relationship for far too long. And so what happened as a result of that imbalance was that China, of course, amassed huge US dollar reserves, and so China has become now a major player in the international financial system. And so in terms of international institutions, what did China do? Well, China, first of all, of course, looked, just as Japan had in its rise, to play a bigger role in the IMF and the World Bank. But just like Japan was knocked back by the US and Europe from playing a proportionate role, China also was knocked back from playing a proportionate role in the IMF and the World Bank. The World Bank is very comfortable to be led by the US, and the IMF is very comfortable to be led by Europe. And there's no willingness there to provide a proportionate share, proportionate to the scale of the Chinese economy or its weight in the financial system. And so China has done what Japan did. Japan responded to its exclusion by building the Asian Development Bank. And the Asian Development Bank has been and still is an extraordinarily successful institution in Asia in funding infrastructure and connectivity development for the developing countries of Asia. And when Japan tried to set up an Asian monetary fund, however, it was blocked by the United States from doing that. But the ADB has been a great success. And so again, China, in looking at the success of countries before it and looking at what Japan had done, China has adopted a rather similar strategy. China built the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, launched in 2016, and just like with the ADB, the AIIB, the Chinese bank, offered the world membership. Barack Obama and his administration initially had travelled the world trying to talk countries out of joining it. they weren't very successful because only Japan refused to join the AIIB, and virtually every other major economy of the world did join the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. And just like the ADB, the AIIB has now, in its short history, demonstrated, I think, world-class international finance management and infrastructure projects. It's tended to partner with other multilateral development banks, so it hasn't done a whole lot of projects on its own yet. It's quite deliberately decided to partner with other institutions. It hasn't done any of the things that the United States accused it of doing. It hasn't favoured China. The country that has been the major beneficiary of AIIB infrastructure projects has been India, which is arguably China's rival. So the AIIB is functioning as a public good, as a very positive new international institution in the global system. So I think this too is part of my argument that if we look back at that period of the rise of China, actually it was a pretty successful period, that actually China's institution building, its integration into global institutions was very successful all around. Where it failed in the United States was, I would argue, United States policy failure. And I think to some extent China also runs big trade surpluses with Europe. So my critique of the US perhaps could be applied to Europe as a whole, but of course Europe as a whole doesn't really exist. Europe, of course, is made up of a whole lot of separate economies that operate quite differently. Even Germany and France in their relationships with China are quite distinct. So we'd have to unpack the differences between all of the European economies. And I think here in Serbia and in Hungary next door, there's a very different story and a very successful story of economic interdependence there with China as well, which has been beneficial to both sides. So the narrative that China's economic rise has been bad for the world, on close inspection is a little bit difficult to accept. And in particular, there's another dimension to this. And so the rise of China, and behind it and following the rise of India as well, by the way, and the rise of Brazil and Indonesia and other countries in the future that are on the trajectory, that are pursuing similar policies and are heading in the same direction. This is the big shift that's happening in the world, and that is that the developing world is actually becoming just as important in the international economy, but not yet as important in the international system, not yet in the geopolitics and the political institutions of the world, but economically the shift of power to the developing world that China has represented, but that will be represented as well by these other rising powers. This is the big shift. So China has not only successfully integrated itself with the advanced economies, but it has very successfully in the last couple of decades integrated itself with the developing world, because China has an optimism and a strategic confidence that the developing world largely can follow the same model. Now, whether this is misplaced, I don't know, because I have a confidence about East Asia, that East Asia certainly can pursue the same models. And so there are the areas of dysfunction that still exist in East Asia, like Myanmar, for example, North Korea, that are just disasters. If they were to adopt all of the successful elements of the development model of East Asia, they could succeed as well. I'm an optimist, but they'd have to solve their geopolitical and political problems in order to do that, of course. But the economic conditions are there. Whether, though, the East Asian development model can be applied to Africa, to other places, is a big question, though. But I think the Chinese are very optimistic, and this could be partly the Chinese falling into the same trap that the Americans have fallen into as a major power, and that is seeing the world through their eyes, assuming that everyone wants to be like them. So China today, when it talks about the developing world, increasingly it talks as if it has all the answers, and as if it knows the model, it knows how to develop, it knows what the developing world needs to do. Now, it uses a very respectful language. The developing world likes this. They appreciate that China speaks respectfully to the developing world. China it says to developing countries, you have agency, you have the right to develop, and you have the right to be independent, and your borders to remain sovereign, and you have the right, just as we did, to develop, and we would like to help you and we'd like to support you. So the language, the way that the communication occurs is a very respectful language, and that's very powerful in the developing world. I worked for a few years for the Pacific Islands Forum, which is the regional organisation in my part of the world for the developing countries of the Pacific. And so I can say this from experience, that my colleagues in the Pacific Islands countries really appreciated the respectful language they receive from China. They're also cautious about it. They're not stupid. They know that this is language. They know that underneath the calm and friendly and respectful language, they know that there's a great power emerging that has interests. But even so, we shouldn't underestimate the discourse, the language that China is using in the developing world strikes a chord. It wins friends and influences people, especially when it's attached in some cases with corruption and with relationships, political relationships that are all about serving the interests of certain elites. I mean, there are lots of other clever strategies going on as well that we could talk about in more detail. But I think in terms of big picture trends, the very interesting trend is that China is developing a new discourse. It's developing a new international relations language about a shared future, about using all these beautiful terms. The Belt and Road Initiative is about new Silk Roads of commerce and peace and people-to-people, cross-civilizational understanding and dialogue, all this language that sounds beautiful to the ears, and especially if you are a developing country. And I think, well, this is not a developing country, but here we're in a country that has some problematical relationships with the West. And so I think you probably can appreciate my experience in developing countries is that developing countries have often had a problematical relationship with the West. This is not understood in the West. The West thinks, oh, we give lots of aid and they must love us. They must think we're our great friends. We Australians, the Australian government always talks to the Pacific Islands and says, you're our Pacific family. And the Pacific Islanders go outside the room and they laugh about it, because of course we're not family. I mean, Australia sits there as this rich country, Pacific Islands, some of the poorest countries on earth. And of course, Australia's given lots of aid, but is that really family? Is that really what these countries are looking for is development. They're not looking for well-paid consultants to fly in and to run a workshop. They're looking for a piece of infrastructure. They're looking for a port redevelopment. They're looking for a hospital. They're looking for roads. And this is what China is coming and offering. Now, since China has amassed this huge reserve of US dollars, this capacity, particularly, until its own financial problems of the last few years. But if we go back to the beginning of the Xi Jinping era, when Xi Jinping inherited these huge US dollar reserves, China had the capacity to go to the developing world and say, we can lend you money, you tell us what you need, and we've also got the construction expertise to come and help you build these big projects. And actually, this was very welcome in the developing world. Now, a narrative developed in the English language international relations discourse, that this was a geopolitical trap, that China was trapping these countries in debt. And of course, it wouldn't be the first time that a major economy had trapped other countries in debt. But the interesting thing, I think, about the respectful interaction that China has with developing countries is that China goes to these countries and says, what do you want and what do you need? Doesn't tell them what they must have. It actually listens to what they want. And so in a sense, if there are debt traps, and there are some debt traps, I think, in the developing world. I think in my area of the world, Tonga would be one example. One small Pacific Island country has definitely got itself into too much debt. But I would say that the governments of these countries are responsible for those decisions, because what China is doing is going and entering into a bilateral agreement, and the country that accepts the debt is making a decision to go into a debt. Now they're making a decision with their eyes wide open that debt has to be repaid, and this is the philosophy behind the development model of East Asia. This is the philosophy that Japan had as well, in supporting developing countries with the ADB, and it's the same philosophy that China is applying now. It's saying we're not like the West. We're not going to come and shower you with lots of aid and lots of consultants, and we're not going to tell you what to do. We're not going to lecture you on your human rights and things like that. We are simply going to lend you money for what you tell us you need, but you have to pay us back. And so the Chinese attitude is this is a good discipline. This is actually, you don't just give a poor person lots of fish, you actually teach them how to fish for themselves. That's the Chinese philosophy. And in a sense, it's clever. And you know, this is a controversial thing for a Westerner to say this these days, because we're supposed to say, oh no, isn't this all terrible? This is China trying to take over the world. I don't think it is. I think actually China's rhetoric of non-interference in other countries, in the national sovereignty of other countries, is actually deeply held. It actually goes back to the Bandung Conference in Indonesia in 1957, the origins of the non-aligned movement, which you people here in Belgrade would know all about. The principles from the Bandung era are deeply held in China. In fact, they were principles that were developed by China and India and were taken to Indonesia and were adapted by the non-aligned movement. So these principles of non-interference, of peaceful coexistence, of national sovereignty are very deeply held by the Chinese. Now, there will be contradictions and there will be double standards, I have no doubt, because every great power exerts its power and sometimes overlooks the core principles of its foreign policy, and we can certainly say that about the great powers of recent times like the US and Russia and others. But when it comes to China, I think we should not underestimate their commitment to those core principles, because in a sense they need it. They need to demonstrate to the world and to themselves and to their own people that they will be a different kind of great power, because they suffered so badly at the hands of great powers in the past. And so deep in the Chinese psyche is that century of humiliation and the humiliation of World War II. They don't want to be like the West. They don't want to be another great power that dominates, that lectures people and tells them what to do. They do, however, want to be a great power like China was in the past. So they do want to be the Middle Kingdom. And they do want countries to respect them and to come to them and pay respects that they are a great power. They definitely want that. Kissinger knew that. Even from the days of Kissinger's visit, he paid that respect to the Chinese that they were a great power. And that's definitely what they want, which they're not getting anymore from the West. They're getting what they consider to be disrespect. But they definitely want respect, and they definitely want that from the developing world as well. But do they want to go and intervene in those countries, overthrow governments? Probably not, I think, unless there may be exceptions, and there may be exceptions around China's borders and where China has direct interests. We can expect China to pursue its direct interests, just like any great power. But I think it's unlikely that China, at least in the foreseeable future, I think we're seeing no evidence that China, in these relationships it's developing with developing countries, is trying to actually overthrow governments or occupy governments. Now, whether that's a worst case scenario of the future still remains unanswerable at this point in time. But I would argue as an optimist about the last few decades, that some of the lessons we could draw about the last few decades is that it was possible to successfully absorb China into the international system. And so we have a range of options on that spectrum of how we interact, and how the West in particular interacts with China. We can interact with them as a competitor, and we can drive them away from us and into actions that will be aimed against us, or we can pursue strategies that more deeply integrate them and find ways to coexist and to work together. But it's not so simple, because there are huge differences in worldview. And this is where I think I come back to my opening comments, that a big part of our problem is that we in the West, I think, had an expectation that China was just going to be absorbed into the West, when actually it was being absorbed into an international system, but not into the Western idea of what that international system is. So there's this liberal international order that people are very keen on talking about in my country and in other countries that arguably are part of that liberal international order. There's a small proportion of the world's population, maybe it's around 12 or 13% of the world's population, that lives in what we call in that English language discourse the liberal democracies. But that's not where most of the world lives. And so when we talk about the rise of China, and arguably the rise of India as well, and Indonesia and Brazil and others as well, these are not countries that you can describe in that Western sense as liberal democracies. They're not Belgium, they're not Australia, they're not Canada. They're quite culturally, politically different. And so the question becomes, you can definitely develop a system of global economic interdependence. So the last few decades successfully demonstrated that for most of us, but for most of the developing world, hugely successful the last few decades. We've massively reduced international poverty. There's been a huge shift in equality in the world towards a more equal world in recent decades. So for the developing world, it's a great success story the last few decades. Of course, for the US and Europe, less so, because they're feeling the pain of adjustment to that new world order. But economically, you can see that we could find a new way to resolve these problems, and we could manage to find a way forward. The problem becomes a mindset one. It becomes, if the expectation in the Western mind is that the only kind of rising power that can be accepted is one that is a Western one. The one that is the only way China's rise can be acceptable is if China Westernizes. And I fear that that is a view that has taken hold in Washington and in capitals of a number of countries in the West. I would still argue in the case of Australia being in the region and having such a long and successful history of the last few decades of deep integration with the region, I don't think Australians think that way in general. In the Australian elite, of the foreign policy elite, the business elite, the average Australian perhaps is very influenced by the media, which in Australia tends to be very anti-China and very simplistic. That's a different matter. But the elites in Australia, I don't think generally are of the view that China is ever likely to westernise, and I don't think most Australians who have interaction with China have any expectation that countries like the US and Australia can somehow impose some solution on China. I think much more broadly, if you look at the comments of Australian elites, both sides of politics, by the way, you see that there's a view that there needs to be an accommodation. There needs to be some new process of accommodation. There will need to be some new rebalancing that's going to have to happen in the Asian region. And while it's a long way away from here, I'm arguing to you today that this is fundamental for world order. We are approaching a fundamental realignment of world order. I would argue, I'm not an expert in the Ukraine conflict or anything like that, but I would argue that conflicts like that are relatively marginal to the global order. I think they're important here in Europe, and I absolutely understand that. But I would argue that the global order shift that is occurring is in East Asia, and it will extend to South Asia too, because China will be followed by India, but India's another case, and it has a whole lot of other characteristics, and it'll be a messier, more complicated, potentially slower process. But it is coming as well. We are heading to a world, and maybe it's it's not for another 50 years, but we're heading to a world that will be dominated by China and India and the big, what we today call developing countries. But the countries with the big populations, once they are liberated by trade and economic development to play their full role in the international system, then actually the international system balances out. It no longer is dominated, as it has been for the last couple of hundred years, by this very small proportion of the world. It becomes much more about the balance of power in Asia, which is where most of the world's population lives, and increasingly will be where the basis of the global economy will be. So this is existentially catastrophic for the United States, and maybe for Europe too, because of Europe's cultural and security dependence on the United States as well. Maybe that's a controversial thing to say, I don't know, but I think the times of Europe being dominant in the world have passed, and I think Europe understands the dominance of the United States, but entering into a world with a much more powerful developing world, and we probably won't even use those terms in another 50 years. It will be a different world order. So what does that world order look like? Do we need a war to resolve it? I hope not. I don't think so, because I don't think that this is about a big geopolitical shift in borders. I really don't believe that's what this is. I don't think China, I hope I'm right, I don't think China has any interest in dominating the region like Japan did. Japan was copying Europe. It was copying the era of European empires. I think China believes in China. China wants to do things a Chinese way, and China is only interested in China. China has its own civilization. It doesn't believe that other countries could possibly be like China. It has no interest in running another country. It has Chinese elites that I've talked to for many, many years have a very good understanding that their mentality, their cultural mentality, their political system cannot be transplanted. You can't take the Chinese system and impose it on Myanmar next door. Even relatively small Myanmar, I mean, it's not small, but relative to China, Myanmar, this totally dysfunctional, crisis-ridden place, if it was next door to the United States would just go in and take over and try and resolve the mess there. China can't even solve Myanmar. It just watches it from a distance. So let me wrap up my introductory comments, and then I really welcome your questions. So I think where this leaves us is that there are a lot of question marks around how this new world order shakes out. I think the critical question we've got to do is we've got to be able to put ourselves into the shoes of other countries and other cultures. So we in the West have to be able to imagine how the world looks to China, for example. It's incredibly important that the next generation of foreign policy and not to mention business and economic thinkers need to learn Chinese, for example. They need to get inside the headspace and to be able to develop strategies for our success in every country of the world. We are just going to have to learn to be able to negotiate, to do deals, to do bargains with China. And then sometimes that's going to mean showing our strength. Sometimes it's just going to mean using our brains, that we actually understand how they think, and not to just impose our views, because it's unlikely, I think, in the long term that just imposing is going to be the solution. So why don't I leave it there, and happy to have questions.
David, thank you very much for this most interesting lecture, and I think the most valuable thing that we can hear here is exactly this kind of your personal experience you had in giving us worldview from both Western perspective and Chinese perspective. And I believe that we will now have a lot of questions from the audience, both here and online. And after that, I will abuse my right as moderator to also ask questions, which is a tradition here. So let's start. And I would just like to remind our dear colleagues and guests to please always introduce themselves when asking a question. So first question goes to Director Đurković. Please, yes.
Sorry, the whole idea was not to abuse my manager. It's going to be lasting for just a little bit more. I just needed to thank you very much for coming and to thank to our colleagues from Danube Institute. This is also, we have to say that we are having David with us here in a way as a courtesy of Danube Institute from Budapest, where we have a lot of friends and many good people have already come, as David Essenberry and many other people here. So I'm very thankful to them for facilitating this kind of cooperation. And also the wife of David is today with us, and I'm very happy that I could greet her. And just basically to greet, I hope that they're still with us. We have some very interesting guests via Zoom there. Professor Greg Simmons, whom you probably know, he told me, who used to work at Uppsala University, has been with us. I hope that he is still there. Then we have Dr. Xiao Liu from the Chinese Institute of Evaluation of the Work of the Institutes for their Academy of Sciences. We had fantastic delegation. She was part of that, what was that, 10, 15 days ago. They were doing some evaluation generally about what we are doing. So it was really great to have the exchange with them. And she was also with us here. And our friend Sasha Lazarevich, who also we had the possibility to listen to him. He's a very interesting person, maybe for you. His wife is also Chinese, and he's very often going there. He's Serbian origin, living in Switzerland, working for IBM on the issues like artificial intelligence and quantum computers. So I just want to invite them also to join us with questions. I have a lot of my own, but I will leave that for afterwards. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Stevan Gajic, Institute of European Studies. Thank you so much, Professor, for this very thought-provoking lecture. I have loads of questions, but I'll start with one association. Back in 2010, I was a witness to a lecture in Budapest at the premises of the Hungarian Academy, right by the Danube River. Lecture by George Soros that was dedicated to the future of China. And what he said was very shocking in a sense to me. He said, basically referring to one of the last points that you made, that basically only westernized China is an acceptable China for the West. As if the West is the final arbitrary of what is good and what is evil in the world, of morality, basically. So he was formulating it in the sense that he hopes that China is not going to be lost for the open society. He didn't even mention Russia, which was very indicative to me. I thought maybe they have some other plans for this country, like dissolution, which is now, if you hear this discourse about decolonization of Russia and so on and so forth. So what I think here, that I also agree with you that this war that we are witnessing now is not a war about territories, but about ideology, about the worldview. And this brings me to my second point, which was Trump's note about the United States making the worst case scenario for themselves by making enemies with both China and Russia, which naturally brought them together. So now, I don't know about East Asia, but in Europe we are at the point which is extremely dangerous, where because of these ideological, I would say dogmas in the Western elites today, definitely in NATO and the White House, we are at the brink of a complete catastrophe for Europe, definitely. So what do you think might happen from this point? I mean, there's another thing that I wanted to mention. You've mentioned China coming with development to other countries, and that is exactly what they did here, because China is quite welcome, basically. There are, of course, issues with environment and so on, but China is giving us the opportunity for development. And Serbs know all the Western tricks. So basically, how I like to call us, we are hyper-Westernized Kurds. We are extremely frustrated for the last 30 years, although we are maybe not showing that much in the public discourse. Maybe our leaders are not showing that on the outside. But China comes with the development, and that is very welcomed by, I would say, the overwhelming public majority who says, okay, you don't tell us what should we think about, how should we define gender, or how should we, think about this or other question in our own country. But my point is, we have an ideological problem with the West, which more and more behaves as a rogue partner in the international community. So how do you think this will play out? Do you think that there is a possibility for a non-escalatory scenario? Thank you.
Thank you. That's an incredibly difficult question to answer in any simple sense. I mean, these are the questions of our times. I think this is a huge challenge. I think as an Australian, I would say that we in our part of the world would never imagine that we can go to Indonesia next door and preach to them about the way that they act. We preach to them about their culture or about their political institutions. We just don't imagine that we could do that. It doesn't occur to us. We certainly believe that there are things we can offer, advice and support in development, and of course we'd be happy to share our experiences, but we don't have an expectation that we can impose. And so I think that's the insight that I'm bringing here, that I think from my perspective as an Aussie, I think as a Westerner, so I come from a liberal, democratic Western country, but one that's in Asia. And so I think many of us have a different perspective, therefore, from our friends who we have absolutely common values with in other liberal democracies. But my analysis is that the liberal democracies, the big ones, have been so internally focused on these big ideological wars between left and right, which left and right, let's face it, doesn't really exist anymore. So they've had to invent new battles, and these cultural battles and other values battles of Western liberal democracies are making it seem to people in the West like there's this mortal battle to come for values, when actually the international system has never been about values. When the European empires travelled around the world trashing other cultures and committing genocides in places like my home country, it was not about values. It had nothing to do with values. So values is not what international relations is about. It's domestic politics is. And so if you're fighting a domestic political election in the EU, or in the US, well, of course, you might use values to whip up populist support for your side, and this could be people on the left liberal side, or it could be people on the right wing. Will use values to mobilise people, to polarise and divide people. But when it comes to international relations, if you define your international relations in terms of values, you run into all kinds of trouble. And I think the United States has discovered this, and I think some of the great thinkers in the United States. And the United States does have a great, vibrant debate about its foreign policy, and I think many thinkers in the US understand full well the danger of describing your international relations as all about values. So I think that it's well understood in the US that that's for domestic consumption, and it's actually not serious. The serious practice of international relations is about the practical practice of geopolitical interests and your international economic and other interdependence with countries. It's not simply values alone. Europe worries me even more than the US, because I think the US will resolve all of those issues in time. It has to, because it's so globally important, and it will have to find an adjustment with China. The alternative is too awful to think about, because if it doesn't find a solution to living with China, then obviously it ends up in conflict, and that's so catastrophic. I mean, that it's hard to believe that would be a rational course of action for the US. I think conflict with China would probably lead to the collapse of the US, so it would be, and certainly would lead to the destruction of the US hegemony in the Pacific. So any conflict between the US and China would simply be suicidal, I would have thought, for the US. But for Europe, it's a bit different, because Europe's battles, I think, are not so much about the future, but a bit more about the past, I think. Perhaps I can, very unfairly as an Aussie, make that sort of outside observation. And so it's the European discussions about China are not really discussions about the real world. I mean, Europe's talking about wanting a green transition to the green economy, and then it announces yesterday that it's putting tariffs on electric vehicles from China. Well, if they're serious about a green transition, they need all the electric vehicles they can get. They need to be not just building them in Europe, but importing them as well to fill the gaps, because they're not producing enough in Europe. So, yeah, I think all of these questions are very difficult to answer in any simplistic sense. One more thing I would say is that from my research I've been conducting in across Eurasia, that there are a number of countries that in the Western narrative would be expected to fall into spheres of influence, like Kazakhstan and Mongolia, countries that I visited in the last year, that are totally misunderstood in the West. But these are countries that are now in the post-Soviet era finding their agency. They're finding their national identity, and they're defining their national interests. They're not having debates about values. They're having debates about what are our interests, and you know, it is in those countries' interests to have less influence from Russia. It is in their interests to have more economic relationship with China, but they don't want to replace Russian influence with Chinese influence. So they are very carefully negotiating a more multipolar world and trying to develop a more multipolar Eurasia. So the work that's going on there with those countries that are often overlooked in the Western narrative, but they're pretty important. I mean, the scale of Kazakhstan, even though it's a tiny population, but the scale of its geopolitical importance is quite important. So if those countries can find a way to coexist with Russia and to be more deeply integrated with China, and to maintain stronger links to other advanced economies, if they can manage that, that will be a very interesting roadmap for other countries to look at. Because if countries with such small populations but vast resources can do it, there's no reason why much more powerful and much larger countries can't also find a way to coexist in a new multipolar world.
Rajko?
Hello, I'm Rajko Petrovic from this institute. I would like to have one comment and one short question. I'm dealing with Latin American region, so you know probably very well the Chinese position there. Until 1970s, practically any of Latin American countries didn't even recognize the existence of China as an independent state. They were recognizing only so-called Republic of China or Taiwan. But today, 50 or 55 years later, China is a dominant economic player in South America, and its positions in economy, politics, culture are also increasing in Central American region. So that part of the world shows to us how Chinese influence and strength is dramatically increasing. So this was very useful for me, all those analysis about Chinese positions in Far East Asia, etc. So my question is, what about Chinese immigrants in Australia? About their number, their influence, importance of their groups, etc. Thank you once again.
I think again this is a good news story, and sometimes the media, which in Australia is dominated by a couple of oligarchic interests that commercially benefit by whipping up hysterical politics, but actually Australia is such a stable democracy that its crazy media, in a sense, doesn't really matter. In fact, I don't think most people younger than me take a lot of notice of the media these days anyway. So you might think from Australian media that there are all kinds of problems in the Chinese Australian community. I've just spent a couple of months back home in Australia. You walk down the street of a city in Australia and you see many Chinese faces. And maybe if you're walking down a street in Sydney, maybe 7 out of 10 people might look Chinese, but they're Australians. I mean, most of them are Australians. Some of them might be tourists or students. There are a lot of Chinese students in Australia, about 350,000 Chinese students in Australian universities. So that's a big income earner for Australia, is educating Chinese middle class students. But generally, the migration story has been a great success. So the Chinese arrived in Australia about the same time as my ancestors from Prussia and from Germany arrived, and that was in the 1850s. So the early arrivals that came to look for gold faced a relatively hostile reaction from the other groups that were established on the gold fields, and so there were clashes. The Chinese were accused of working too hard. Does that sound familiar? They were accused of never taking a break. They were accused of working on the Sabbath and things like that shocked the Europeans on the gold fields. But interestingly, Chinese migration grew, and Chinese played an important role in the early formation of those British colonies. The colony of Victoria, which is now the state of Victoria, where Melbourne is situated, in the late 1850s, 20% of the Victorian population was Chinese. So Australia has a very long history of having Chinese population and actually relatively successful living together. So while there'd been riots and problems on the gold fields, they faded into memory. Most Australians wouldn't even be aware of that today. And then in the 20th century, you had, after a number of decades where Australia ran a racial system, like many countries did, like the US and other countries as well, blocking Chinese migrants for a number of decades. But by the 1960s, by the modern era, the Australia that I grew up in, had an open immigration system. And as I'm sure you know, many people from Yugoslavia came to Australia from many places in the world. But increasingly by the 80s, 90s, there were large numbers of Chinese coming to Australia. And so for many decades, actually, China has been the number one source country of migrants into Australia. I think last year it was just eclipsed by India for the first time. But China's been a very important source country. So you're now at a point where we haven't quite got back to the level of the 1850s, but we're at a level now where certainly in many parts of Australia it feels like about 20%. Now it's probably about 10% of the Australian population is Chinese, but it certainly feels more like 20%. And that is probably because there are a lot of students and tourists and business people as well. So in general Australian society, you're seeing Chinese people everywhere. So every Australian in the major cities has Chinese friends, has, maybe Chinese partners or business associates. Most of the Australian economy is integrated with China. So actually it's been a great success story. So there've been a few media stories about, there were 2 instances where there were a couple of students at universities, causing some problems. So 2 out of 350,000 a year. So so my argument is 2 or 3 cases of, some espionage or some crazy behaviour or some corruption that has occurred from time to time. The media will talk about this as if it's a Chinese problem, when actually it's just the problem of an individual. And the fact that they were Chinese is probably not actually the point. The point is there are also people who are not Chinese who are engaged in espionage and corruption and things like that too. So the Australian story actually has been a very successful one because of the nature of Australian society. It is a deeply multicultural society, and like Canada and like New Zealand, these are multicultural societies where multiculturalism works, where actually people have come from all around the world and they have found a way to live with one another and to not define ourselves by our ethnicity. Now it's almost unthinkable in Europe for me to explain this, but in Australia it's just natural. We just describe ourselves as multicultural and we're proud of that. Whereas I know the word sometimes in Europe has very different connotations, but in Australia it just means a great success story.
We will now have a few questions from the Zoom and one more question from the audience.
Question from Sasha Lazarevich. Will the West be able to accept that human rights and individual freedoms and their definitions according to the West are not universal values, as this has not been recognized by China?
This is a very difficult question, I think, because the international covenant on human rights, the international law that's developed over the last few decades in the UN system has been based on concepts of human rights that have been signed up to by all countries, but not abided by equally and in the same spirit by all countries. And we can point the finger at individual countries. We could point the finger at any major power, any of them, including the US, and we could find human rights problems, and arguably we should. I mean, you know, as someone, I'm talking about being an Australian here, I mean, arguably we should expose problems in the world and we should talk about them. Whether we make judgments that one society is more likely to abuse human rights than another and therefore apply different standards to that country, that's another matter, because it comes back to the practice of international relations. If we actually want to find a way that we can negotiate and compromise and find ways to live together, then we have to find language that is not constantly judging other societies. So yes, there are individual cases that I think as a citizen of a country like Australia, I think we should highlight an individual case. So where China recently locked up an Australian journalist and kept her away from her children for a couple of years, that's the kind of case that, of course, individual citizens are going to want to pursue and are going to want to raise. Governments have to figure out the best way to have that negotiation and to solve the problem. Sometimes you do it low-key, and sometimes you work behind the scenes to solve a human rights problem, or sometimes you make big public declarations because you judge that that's going to be the most effective way to solve a problem. Sometimes also, though, we manufacture exaggerations, and in all societies, in all countries. I mean, I was just talking before about Australia's experience of multiculturalism, but yet we still hear lots of criticism of Australia based on some things that Australia does. It has a very strict border control policy, for example, and will be absolutely criticised by international human rights lawyers, saying we shouldn't be turning boats away with illegal, so-called illegal asylum seekers, but we should be accepting them all on shore. So every country in the world can be criticised. And I think it is a question about what kind of international relations do you want? Do you want an international relations that's about stability and peace and interdependence? And then if you have a human rights agenda, as my country does, if you believe in promoting positive human rights, well then absolutely advocate and talk about what good human rights practice is, but doesn't mean that you use sanctions or use other measures that actually are not proven in my experience to be very effective. It's certainly using sanctions against a country because of its human rights practice has no precedent of working in my experience, apart from the South Africa apartheid case, where where much of the world was trying to end apartheid, had to drag the United Kingdom kicking and screaming to join us in putting sanctions against South Africa, and eventually, because they were unanimous, almost universally applied against South Africa, the regime finally did, I think, bend to international pressure. But I think it's a highly unusual, exceptional circumstance where the international community can change the human rights practices of a whole system. But individual cases, absolutely.
Milica?
Hello, I'm Milica Ilić, a research trainee from Institute of European Studies. Thank you very much for your presentation. I have just one short question when it comes to economic relations and the Chinese economic strategy. Well, we saw that Saudi Arabia has decided not to renew the 50-year petrodollar agreement with USA. And in your opinion, is there possibility for Chinese currency, for Chinese yuan, to replace dollar as a main currency of a field of global petrol trade? Is the Chinese government interested in replacing this currency? Thank you.
It's been a very interesting ride the last few years to see the ripple effects through the international system of the US sanctions against Russia. And I think if China had been intent on replacing the US currency, this would have been the time to have seen some evidence of that. I think the opportunity of the last couple of years was there for China to demand that international payments be made in renminbi, and for China to more internationalize its financial system as an alternative to the US dollar. The fact that that hasn't really happened, I think, is more consistent with generally what we can observe with Chinese international economic behavior of the last decades, and that is that China's engaged in a slow process of internationalizing. It's not engaged in some big revolutionary shift. I don't think China expects or would succeed actually in trying to replace the US dollar overnight. But no doubt in the long run, of course, China would like to see its currency as playing a major role. When you are a major currency provider to the world, it brings all kinds of benefits. As the US knows, you can have very cheap money. You can basically print money. So no doubt in the long run, China is interested in internationalization of the renminbi, but it would require, if it was to compete with the US dollar now, it would require an opening up of its capital controls and a change in its economic strategy that's not quite ready for, because it's still protecting its capabilities to develop its economy at its own pace. And I think China's very worried, and should be very worried after its economic problems of the last couple of years. It's very worried about a flight of capital. So if China was to seek to suddenly become the international reserve currency and open up its system to the openness that the US has, yes, that might encourage some to invest more in renminbi, but it would also, I think, in the current circumstances, it'd be more likely that Chinese holders of renminbi would rush to take that money out into the international system, which China's desperately trying to prevent at the moment. So I think it's a long-term question. I don't think it's one for today.
Okay, Alex thinks that we should be finishing in exploiting you, so we will slowly get to the end, but sorry for abusing you. It's really a privilege listening to very practical stuff that you had to share with us, especially coming from Australia, which is having fantastically interesting position there concerning China. So, by the way, when we were, Jovits and me, 2 years ago in Sydney, I lived in Chestwood, actually, which is new fancy Chinese, absolutely Chinese dominated part in almost downtown, very close to university and so on. And it was very interesting for the same issue. And I saw actually that Australia has already came to 26 million people, which used to be projection for another, I don't know, 20, 30 years. And especially immigration from China and India have come to almost 1 million people each of community, which means that they are already part of the. And I was very impressed to see how Australia is being changing in that sense, So, but I will try to focus on. I have at least 10. Different issues to ask you, but I will try to focus on 3, which might be interesting. First, transfer of technology. You were mentioning actually 79 is, of course, the most important year, but Stefan and me are very great fans of Adam Curtis, the famous director, which had in several of his documentaries, and one in which he reminded us actually that at first glance Deng Xiaoping also had the idea of political liberalization. You remember when this was kind of opening, putting the freedom news to the big wall, which threatened to dissolve the country very soon. And in a way, they saw that also in 89 that, so this is very interesting political combination. Some people think that it reminds to the 18th century absolutism in Europe, especially France, but also other ones who created actually the serious state with the one functioning legal system, which was the precondition for real market economy and so on. So we all know the story. They just said, okay, we will cease with these political experiments, and okay, but you, on the other hand, you will not get the free speech and so on, but you can get rich. And everything started from that onward. But the difference, and correct me if I'm wrong, concerning the relationship of the West with the USSR until the end, until the 89, 90, was actually that there was, ban on transfer of technology. It was not the case with China, as far as I know, because the development of China in the 80s was very much based on transfer of technology, which was left for them. On the other hand, China was very clever to think, of course, 50 years ahead, and they sent a bunch of thousands, hundreds of thousands, almost millions of students outside. They returned this knowledge, and now they are already leading system or educational system for many things, including the electrical vehicles. And that's why West is threatened to defend itself already. So my question was the first one: who decided that the West, and why? We are like conspiracy theorists, but that's not what I'm asking. Actually, when they decided that they want and they will let Chinese get technology and capital, which are, of course, preconditions for their development and inclusion into global system. And now the second question is about AUKUS, of course. What you preserved us, what you showed us now, was very encouraging idea and perspective from Australia, which is trying to, and actually, if I understood, this is the dominant position in Australian elite, that you don't want to have conflicts with China, and that you want to work with the Western partners to avoid the conflict. But what we saw as AUKUS, in which the whole, as far as I understood, and I heard a lot of people from America and Britain especially, they saw that as very anti-Chinese coalition. And that was the first one, the first move actually that Biden did when he came to power. So how do you see that, and how does your position gets into that, and how do Australia actually perceive AUKUS in the long-term perspective? And third, and I'm finishing with that, is the question of crime in China nowadays. Of course, we don't know a lot about China. We are very hardly coping with our region, Turkey and Russia and the West and so on. So we are completely ignorant. That's why it's very important to have you here. And I'm asking you as an expert for social issues and many things who've been going there. Of course, it's a very big, massive system. And of course, the crime is necessary. Crime existed even in USSR in many different forms and so on. So what is happening with crime? How do they deal with it? I mean, from regularly, pickpocketing until big corruption and organized crime. Does it exist? Of course, there was a lot of speculation and accusation outside that the state was also using triadas for technology stealing, blah, 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 whatsoever. But whatever you can give us about the comment, how do they deal with those issues? And I'm finishing with really great thanking for the things we could hear today. Thank you very much.
Interesting range of questions. I think the question of technology transfer didn't really occur to people in the 1980s as a question, because the early development of the Chinese economy in that period was low-value manufacturing. And so really there was no highly sophisticated technology being transferred in the 1980s, early 90s. The businesses from the advanced economies that went to China were doing essentially the same thing they were doing with other developing countries, and that is they were transferring technology, which was an expectation of all developing countries. I recall it was an expectation in Central and Eastern Europe as well after 1989 that Western countries would transfer technology as well. So it's not an unprecedented expectation that there'll be a transfer of technology, but I don't believe in that period that the question of highly sensitive security issues was really front and center in people's minds. I think that has been a more recent phenomenon. And maybe what happened here, like with everything in relation to China, and this is one of my central points, is I think that maybe the US and Europe just had their eyes elsewhere for absolutely understandable reasons. And it really appears to have only been after the collapse of the US financial system in 2008, and then the economic collapse in Europe as well, which in these parts of the world is called a global financial crisis, but of course was not global. It was Atlantic, and it was avoided in the Asia-Pacific region, largely because of China. I think it was after that economic crisis that affected the West that people started to notice China. I think apart from obscure international scholars, the average person in America was not really focused on China. They were really not noticing what was going on, but definitely by 2008, it was very evident to those of us who were dealing with China that China had arrived. China had become the second biggest economy in the world, but it's almost as if it really wasn't noticed until the last 10 or 12 or so years, when China's become a central issue in the West. So the question of technology transfer and the rising security concern about China has, I think, only really happened since that time. There was also a huge expulsion of people from China who Chinese claimed to be US spies a few years ago, interestingly, around the same time as the switch in thinking that occurred. So there's been a massive reduction, arguably, in US capabilities to understand China as a result of that. And there always was a lack of real expertise as well in the US system and in Europe in relation to China. The expertise in relation to the Middle East, for example, is much deeper, or expertise in relation to Russia was almost always much deeper. So I think perhaps a lot of people had their eye off the ball, but there have always been security dimensions to technology transfer to China. As an Australian, I would say we've always been aware I used that word before about being cautious. We've always been aware that China is a rising power, and that does bring security implications. That's the explanation for why Australia has been deepening its relationship with the US, deepening its alliance with the US, not stepping away from it as the Chinese expected, but the rise of China and China's assertiveness in the South China Sea and other assertiveness has pushed countries like Australia to deepen their security relationships. But Australia, on the technology question, never really had an issue because Australia wasn't transferring deeply sensitive technology to China. Australia was exporting rocks. So it was a pretty simple trade relationship. Then Australia started exporting education and research, deep research partnerships. So actually there were a whole lot of areas of research between China and Australia into robotics and into all sorts of areas that did have security implications. I was a member of the governing body of the University of Sydney, which is one of the leading universities of Australia, 2010 to 2012. And in that period, I can certainly say we were well aware of security issues in relationship to our research partnerships. And Sydney University was ranked 5th in the world for research partnerships with China. So we had a whole array of research partnerships. And some of them did have security implications. And so the university, of course, was deeply aware and deeply embedded in discussing those security concerns with government and ensuring that there were guardrails, which is the latest fashionable term since Biden. There were guardrails. There were ways of governing and ensuring that highly sensitive material wasn't being sent to China. But maybe the US and Europe were a little bit slow to come to this party and to realize that, of course, there are security questions. And as China rises, there will increasingly, I think, be questions about technology. And the US switch to trying to prevent China's technological rise is no doubt entirely security driven, although it also has the added benefit for the US that it slows China's economic rise. But in the medium term, I would argue it will simply bolster China's economic rise because China will just invest all the more into its own technological development. And just as the Americans were surprised by Sputnik, well, they're certainly going to be surprised by the chips and the other technological advances, AI and things like that in China, because China's investing so deeply. So it's the thing to watch. It's very interesting to watch.
So just one sentence, actually. No, it's okay because now it's
Oh, that's right. It's very interesting. And I think there's a lot more to play out in that area. I think in terms of Australia's embrace of AUKUS, this is a function of the shifting order. That there's nothing new about Australia being allied with the US, by the way. I mean, that happened because of World War II. So the Japanese threat to Australia was a very serious threat, and Japanese didn't ever make it to mainland Australia, but they certainly made it to Papua New Guinea, which was an Australian territory at the time. And the Japanese were bombing Australian cities and more than they bombed Pearl Harbor and places like that. So the existential threat to Australia was very serious. Britain made it very clear they were not going to defend Australia or any of their former colonies when they left Singapore at the end of 1941. And so Australia had to make a huge mind shift from being a part of the British Empire. It had to switch its allegiance to the United States. Australia at that time had a population, I think, of about 5 or 6 million people, and it had the Japanese Empire on its way. So Australia switched to the US, and it's developed its allegiance to the US ever since, in rather the same way that Australia in the 19th century had an allegiance to the British Empire. What happens in the 21st century will be very interesting to watch, because culturally Australia is very aligned with the US. In security terms, it's very aligned with the US, but in economic terms, it's absolutely deeply interdependent with China, as is the whole Asia Pacific. So if the US at some point asks countries like Australia to choose, that actually will be a very difficult decision for countries like Australia to make, because Australia is a very rich country because of China. And it could be a very poor country if it had to choose the United States. And a good example of that is what happened in recent years when the previous Australian government provoked China by saying and doing a few, what I would argue were pretty stupid things, provoking China, including making almost an implication that China had caused COVID, which was such an outrageous slur to China, such a stupid thing for any government to have said about a virus. But this led, as we know, to China sanctioning a whole range of Australian exports. And what happened when Australia was hit by $20 billion worth of sanctions from China? Well, the US went straight to China and replaced the Australian products. So the US didn't come to Australia's help. The US took Australia's market and went straight to China. So Australians are well aware of this, but they're also well aware of the fact that there could be a threat in future, because we all know that the geopolitical realities of the world are that there can be a threat. We all know that. You know that. We know that in Australia too. We've been very lucky for 250 years that no one's actually made it to our shores. But if someone did in the future, well, you know, Australians still believe that they might just need American assistance. So I think it's unlikely Australia's going to break that alliance. So when Australia was able to negotiate access to the technology to run its own fleet of nuclear submarines, which gives Australia the capability to project its power much closer to China, that could be deployed in two ways. It could be deployed offensively in support of the US to provoke conflict, which I would argue would be madness for Australia to do, but it could also be deployed defensively in demonstrating to China that Australia is not a soft option, that Australia is a strong country. It's a country, as you say, of 26 million, but it's one of the richest countries and a continent full of resources. If it also has a fleet of nuclear submarines, that sends a message to China that don't fool with us again. You know, you fooled with us the last couple of years, but don't fool with us again. So actually there's a strong constituency in the Australian population to show strength and to hold that alliance with the US. I don't think, as much as this disappoints my friends in China, I don't think Australia's going to depart the US alliance anytime soon. But my hope is, as an Australian, is that Australia would always act in its interests. And so if the US at some point decides to provoke conflict with China, my hope would be Australia would not join such a conflict. That would be madness. But that would be the question. That's the big question in Australia in the future. Finally, on your final question about crime, I think the real question in China is corruption. I don't think it's crime. China has a very safe, stable set of social mores, social practice that is ancient and that is not in any way westernized, in the sense that in our Western cities we live in fear. You know, a woman feels unsafe to walk after dark in a Western city, or we all fear pickpockets, and you know, I'm always clutching my mobile phone and my wallet when I'm walking in a Western city. But you can walk in the metros of Shanghai or Guangzhou with your mobile phone in your back pocket or your wallet in your back pocket and not have any fear of a pickpocket or anything like that. It just goes against the culture. Of course there's some crime, but it's very minor. It's just not the day-to-day reality of life in China. China has a very different society with a whole lot of very different expectations. However, there is a problem with corruption, and that's probably because I'm from the West. I look at it from a Western perspective. So looking inside from outside, the whole system of doing business in China looks corrupt to a Westerner, because it's entirely integrated to taking people out to dinners and offering people cash payments under the table and all this sort of stuff that in the West is not looked upon as the way you do business. You know, contracts are not worth the paper they're written on in China, because it's all about the relationship that you build, and it's all about making sure that everyone benefits, and so it's just a different approach to doing business. And government is totally linked with business as well, in the sense that the political figures are going to benefit from business projects as well, in ways that in Western countries would be front pages of the newspapers and people would lose their jobs or go to prison. In China, we never really know what happens. What we hear is that people are found guilty of corruption and that they're sent to prison, but sometimes people just disappear as well because of the nature of the authoritarian party state. And so for an outsider to look in, that seems to me to be the problem, the problem of corruption, and not just as an outsider, but talking to Chinese people themselves who are doing business, trying to make a living. It wasn't such a big problem in the 80s and 90s and early 21st century when China was growing so rich and everyone felt comfortable and happy. But these days, you talk to people in China and they're doing it tough. The economy's really slowed and people don't feel the economic opportunities are there. So when they see corruption going on, they're not happy about it either. So it's not just a Western construction, but it's actually the local people themselves are not happy about the level of corruption in China. And that could yet be the kind of issue that could bring political leaders unstuck as well. I think they've got to deal with it. But whether they will, we'll never know because it's a closed system. I'll leave it there.
And one final short comment and question from my side. You were saying about how countries like Kazakhstan, Mongolia have to balance between the influence and wishes of both Russia and China, which are great powers in their regard. And I think that you're absolutely right, not only for the Central Asia, but we now see a number of African countries which are relying, for example, for China for investments and Russia for security. And we can also argue for countries like Serbia, which has traditionally good relations with Russia, and Russia sees us as their own zone of influence, and China now has significant presence also economic in Serbia and sees Serbia as a reliable partner in Europe. So I believe that in the future, in some 10, 20 years, when now things are not so difficult for both Russia and China, meaning that they have a common threat which unites them, but maybe in 20 years when new leadership is in both countries and when things are maybe different and more relaxed for both Russia and China, we will see this kind of cooperation will continue, and will Russia and China find this modus vivendi between themselves. And if the political leadership of both countries then have wisdom not to get into conflict with adversary, we will have a stable multipolar world. Actually, if they become rivals, then the world will again be in a very difficult shape. So my question is about this multipolarity. How do you see the role of China in BRICS Plus? And do you have any comments on how China sees actually the BRICS Plus and the future of it? Will it challenge? Does it see it as challenge to a rule-based order or Western hegemony, or a platform in which the multipolar world will actually not only emerge but be stable? Thank you.
Yeah, I think China wants a multipolar world in which China is a predominant power, in which China, as I said before, is respected as the Middle Kingdom, as a great state, and has relationships with other countries that come and pay it that respect. And I think China will, like in the past, in its what it sees as its glorious history, will dispense favours and give gifts back to other countries in return for that respect. And so this is a very interesting question with Russia, because actually China has not had a history of a friendly relationship with Russia at all. And so you're absolutely right, I think, that the two powers have been pushed together in recent years because of US strategy, partly, but also there's no doubt that there is a meeting of minds between Putin and Xi. I think they genuinely obviously get along, and they obviously like each other's style. And there is a celebration in China of its newfound power, and they like to see a strong leader like a Putin being good friends with their leader. So I think there's a lot of support in China as well for the relationship. I think there's less understanding in China of just how Russia really sees China, because culturally and historically, Russia has actually looked down on China and has actually has taken territory from China and has bred quite a quite a distrust of China in the former Soviet Union. So when you go to places like Kazakhstan, you find that there's a cultural anti-Chinese sentiment that comes, according to the scholars I've talked to in places like Kazakhstan and Mongolia as well, actually, that it comes from the Soviet influence, that in the Soviet days, there was all this propaganda about China, that China's the real threat to you, and China's, Chinese will come one day and steal your wives, and all of this sort of stuff that was a very powerful set of cultural messages that is deeply embedded in those countries. So the elites that I've talked to in those countries who want to develop business with China are well aware that the community has a deep distrust and fear of China, which they attribute to Russian influence in the past. So Chinese are not aware of that. Chinese are blissfully unaware of any of that history because of the way that history is taught in China. I mean, we all teach history, according to our own biases, right? So no one's teaching Chinese children about actually the way Russia treated China in the past. Russia is celebrated as their great friend. So I think there are the roots there of a problem in the future, and I think it's no surprise to you after hearing my comments that my view would be that the US and China need to find a new accommodation. They need to find some new strategic balance in the Pacific. Now, that will be hard for America to do, but they will need to at some point to avoid a conflict. And when they do that, and if they can restore a more productive, cooperative relationship, more like the one they've had for the last 40 years, then Russia potentially becomes a little less important to China. And also, meanwhile, in all of those countries with lots of resources and lots of economic potential, like Kazakhstan and Mongolia, these places are going to potentially cleave more to China. They're going to drift more to China than to Russia because of their history and because the economic interests for those countries will be stronger to link themselves to China than to Russia, arguably. I mean, look, we can't tell the future. No human being has that potential, and maybe my scenario is wrong. Maybe Russia becomes much more successful economically and it's a different scenario. But the scenario I'm imagining is one where China continues to be very important and will be more important to those countries. And so we could see some more tension, I think, in the future between China and Russia, but not in the near term. Not in the short term. It suits both of those countries to collaborate very closely.
Dear guests, dear colleagues, thank you for your time. David, thank you extremely much for your time and for engaging with the audience. I think we really had one important lecture here, and we learned a lot. And sorry, as director said, for abusing your time, but it was really, really important for these things to be heard and discussed. So, dear everyone, thank you for your attention, and see you on the next Tribune. Goodbye.